Climate Law Matters, the transition from oil and gas. Interview with Tessa Khan, Uplift. Hello, listener, and welcome back to our podcast, Climate Law Matters, in which we explore legal developments across different sectors to address the key issue of climate change. I am Steph David, a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers, specialising in environmental and climate change cases. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by Tessa Khan, Executive Director at Uplift, a climate action organisation supporting the efforts to transition rapidly and fairly away from oil and gas production in the UK. She was also the co-founder and co-director of the Climate Litigation Network. I was lucky to hear Tessa deliver one of the keynote speeches at the UKLA annual conference last month. And today we're going to pick up on some of those issues in that speech, in particular the role that law can play in the transition. We are also going to discuss the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion on the obligations of states in relation to climate change, which was handed down only a few days ago on the 23rd of July, 2025. Tessa, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Steph. It's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
First, Tessa, I'm keen to hear more about you and the organisation you head up, Uplift. What's your background and how did you end up working in this space?
Well, it's been a bit of a winding road to getting to where I am today. I started my career in Australia, where I worked in a commercial law firm for a couple of years, but I always knew that I wanted to work more on matters of social justice and human rights in particular. And so I left Australia to do a master's in the UK that was focused on international human rights law, and then went to work for one of the war crimes tribunals in The Hague before moving to Washington, DC, where I worked with the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative, which is effectively their international human rights program, advising on human rights-based approaches to different big public policy issues, so including food security, public health, and crucially climate change. And that's when I first sort of clocked how much of a threat really climate change poses to the enjoyment of human rights. And my next move was to Asia, where I worked on behalf of a regional human rights network for a number of years. And that involved engaging a lot with multilateral processes like the Sustainable Development Agenda, which was being negotiated at the time. And it all sort of culminated in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated. And I had a feeling that as much as people were anticipating a good outcome from that process, that it was unlikely to produce the level of accountability that we really need from national governments in relation to climate change. And I guess as a human rights lawyer, you're constantly dealing with this burgeoning body of international law and a huge gap between what countries have agreed to at the international level and what they actually do in practice nationally. And so I wrote a piece in The Guardian sort of making the point that regardless of what happened in Paris, I thought that governments already had existing obligations based on, for example, human rights law to do more to address climate change. And I was connected via that piece to some lawyers in the Netherlands who at the time were basically supporting a case on behalf of an NGO agenda against the Dutch government, arguing that on the basis of both tort law and human rights law, the Dutch government had an obligation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a greater degree than it was planning to. And that seemed like a very creative argument. I assumed that it would be unsuccessful. There had certainly never been a precedent for arguments like that to succeed. And then I think to everyone's surprise, other than the lawyers involved, they were successful, and it was global news. It was in the New York Times, on the BBC, and it was so exciting because it really was filling that gap, the accountability gap that existed. And I then sort of offered to quit my job and join them both in defending the decision that they had secured because it was inevitably going to be appealed by the Dutch government, but also I thought it would be helpful to translate all of the work that they'd done, which was including on the evidence that underpinned their case, but also the legal norms that they were sort of harnessing and trying to apply, and basically working with lawyers and campaigners in other countries to make sure they made the most of the precedent that had been set in the Netherlands. And so that's how the Climate Litigation Network was born. And I co-directed that for a few years. And as in the past 10 years, climate litigation has really boomed. It's grown exponentially, cases against governments as well as cases against corporates. And so by 2020, I was sort of ready for the next challenge and knew that the kind of climate community was definitely making the most of the opportunities that Decision from Agenda's case provided. And I think in the course of really thinking about climate change and what it is that's stopping governments from taking the action that's needed, began to focus increasingly on the power of the fossil fuel industry, which is, we know, one of the most economically and politically powerful industries in the world. And I saw an opportunity in the UK, which I think can genuinely lay claim to being a climate leader in so many respects. I mean, of course, leadership is relative and no one's really doing enough. But the UK, I think, with the Climate Change Act in 2008, embedding the net zero target in 2018, these are all things that the UK moved first on among major economies. And at the same time, in 2020, the UK was extracting 1 million barrels of oil and gas a day from the North Sea. And that just didn't seem to be drawing much attention compared to, for example, a single coal mine being debated in Cumbria. And I thought the oil and gas industry is, and there is, academic work to support this, but countries that have domestic oil and gas industries end up moving more slowly on all aspects of the climate agenda because of the lobbying power of that sector. And so I thought there was an opportunity to not only try to make the UK a country where we can show that the transition is possible away from oil and gas and that it can be done fairly in a way that supports the oil and gas workforce and doesn't leave communities behind, but also that there's real global value in the UK being a first mover, given the leadership that the UK has demonstrated globally and the momentum it's helped create around climate ambition. So that was basically the genesis for Uplift.
Wow. A lot to unpack in there, Tessa. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. One point we will return to is in relation to this accountability point, the enforcement point, particularly in light of, obviously, the advisory opinion a few days ago, because, as you say, it's all very well and good setting out what international legal obligations are, but actually how does it affect action at the national level and ensuring that national targets are met, which in turn means that international targets can be met. But before I kind of delve into that alongside some domestic legal considerations, one of the points that you made in your UKLA speech was essentially asking the question, what does it mean to be an environmental lawyer? And so I'm really curious to hear your answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an inflection point in a way for environmental lawyers because of a number of different factors. And, what I covered in my keynote address was the fact that it feels like the rule of law is more fragile than it has been, certainly since the post-Second World War, even in the countries where we take for granted, actually, liberal democracy and the institutions associated with that, including the rule of law. And I think the sort of destabilisation of the post-Second World War settlement, the kind of weakening of multilateral institutions, some of that's been accelerated, I think, by the actions of the US, the new US administration, but it's also a result of shifts in the balance of power globally. But I think we're also seeing in a country like the UK and in other European countries really worrying shifts in the way that politically public discourse talks about the judiciary and lawyers and the role that lawyers have. And there have been attacks, as people in the UK know all too well, on judicial independence and really unhelpful rhetoric from the government about the role of lawyers. And we're also seeing a shrinking of civil society space and the space for protest and dissent. Again, not least of all in the UK, which has a Labor government. And I think all of that means that together with the fact that we are at a pretty tricky part of the energy transition, where actually a lot of the policies that we're going to need to meet those targets that we've set, that we know are necessary if we're going to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming, we're at the point where they are going to impact people's lives, their homes, their behaviours. It's not just about switching out coal to gas or gas to renewables in the power supply. It's about the car that you drive, how you heat your home, what you eat, how you move around. And those are more political questions. And so this entire topic is getting more political. the role of lawyers is more political. And at the same time, the gap between where we need to be to stay within safe climate limits and where we are is also growing. So it kind of requires us to be, I think, more radical in our ambition, but also more sensitive to those broader politics and the responsibility that we have to defend the foundational norms and institutions that we've relied on for our work and for law to be effective as a tool and for its legitimacy, in short. So, yeah, quite a lot.
Absolutely. I mean, there's an interesting kind of balance to be struck there, isn't there? On the one hand, being more radical in our approaches, but also on the other, framing arguments in a way which will appeal to judges, particularly given the kind of mounting pressure on the judiciary.
Yeah, and not just to judges, but I think to think about, again, I don't think this should be our jobs, but just this morning, Sky News once again ran a piece about reflecting comments made by Robert Jenrick, who is a shadow minister, about the UK needing to withdraw from the Aarhus Convention because it enables litigation that is against the British national interest. And as we know, the Aarhus Convention is fundamental to protect participation in environmental policy making by the public. It's what so many NGOs and individuals rely on for access to justice. And so I think we are in a moment where we have to think about who we're fighting for and why, and to make those arguments as clearly as possible. So we can't be pigeonholed as elitist and blocking the progress that the country needs, in short.
On that point, and going back to Uplift's work, so you set out the background really helpfully. What is your strategic focus?
So basically, there are two things that really shape the work that we do. The first is the science, which makes it very clear that existing fossil fuel reserves, if burnt, would take us well past 1.5 degrees. And the UN Environment Programme and others publish a report annually, the Production Gap Report, that makes it clear that the existing pipeline of fossil fuel projects are more than double what can be burned in a 1.5 degree world. So basically, there is no world in which we respect the climate targets that we've agreed to and we open up new oil and gas fields. So it's very clear that the UK cannot continue to approve new oil and gas developments in the North Sea. That's number one. The second is what's known as the just transition, and that is ensuring, and again, this speaks directly not just to the principles that I believe in as someone with a background in human rights and social justice, but also the politics of the moment, which is that we cannot allow this transition to lead to large-scale job losses, communities feeling like they are being sacrificed for some more abstract target. And so we do a lot of work to try to ensure that there are policies in place and investments in place that mean that we transition away from oil and gas production in the UK, that workforce is supported into alternative livelihoods. And luckily in the UK, we have this amazing opportunity with offshore wind, which we have to increase multiple fold to meet our own climate targets and renewable energy targets, but which has a lot of skills overlap with offshore oil and gas production. So there's a real opportunity there for that transition to be done well and for supply chains and the manufacturing bases that could really revitalise communities across the UK that used to be industrial heartlands, but, where poverty and inequality is really rising. So we want that to be just as much as a driver of how this transition plays out.
And actually on that point, I was at a talk yesterday and they mentioned the opportunity costs around decommissioning, £40 billion. So potentially in terms of transitioning workforce from oil and gas fields, there could be a big opportunity there in relation to decommissioning those oil and gas fields.
Yeah, absolutely. And the UK, as having one of the most mature oil and gas basins, could end up developing a decommissioning workforce that is then in demand all over the world, that has the skills that are then inevitably going to be needed in other parts of the world. So yeah, there absolutely is an opportunity there.
So thinking now about the role that the law can play in all of this, there have been some amazing legal developments in the UK in relation to oil production in the North Sea, so in particular the Rosebank and Jackdaw oil fields. So your organisation, along with Greenpeace, brought a critical legal challenge to the grant permission to develop those fields in the Scottish Court of Session. Before delving into the details of the claim, what would the development of the Rosebank and Jackdaw oil fields mean for climate change?
So in short, Rosebank is the largest undeveloped oil field in the UK. I mean, the starting point for that question, though, is really, as I said earlier, the fact that there is no room for new oil and gas fields in a 1.5 degree world. So every additional a ton of oil or gas that's extracted is incompatible with what governments have agreed to. And I'm sure lots of your listeners would agree that we're already pushing past safe climate limits given the climate harm that we're witnessing around the world. But Rosebank is the largest undeveloped oil field. It has 500 million barrels of oil and gas equivalent in its reserves. Burning Rosebank's oil would result in emissions that are equivalent to running 56 coal-fired power stations for a year. So it's pretty material, in short. And in addition to that, we don't think that there are any other public interest arguments for the development of the field in terms of energy security, affordability, revenue to the government. So it just is a terrible proposition, and I think summarises or symbolises what is wrong with UK energy policy.
On that, energy security in particular, I mean, it is an argument the government always returns to. I know you have some views on this. Do you mind sharing them?
Yeah, sure. So basically, oil production in the UK North Sea is overwhelmingly exported. So the idea that what ends up being produced, for example, from Rosebank will end up in British cars or supporting British industry is completely unfounded. I mean, these are private companies that will sell their product to whichever market they can get a good price from. And oil is a global market. It goes on a tanker and maybe it gets refined elsewhere and ends up back in the UK. But we don't get any economic or energy security advantage from producing it here. A large chunk of our gas also ends up being exported. But oil in particular, I think, is something that the UK is fundamentally dependent on global markets for. And even with gas, we had this gas price crisis in the last few years. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the wholesale price of gas increased tenfold. People couldn't afford to heat their homes. It was a massive crisis that led the UK government to spend billions in subsidising household energy bills. And it didn't make a shred of difference that we produce gas here, because we don't produce enough to make a difference to global market prices, and that's what we end up paying for it.
So I think I know the answer to this question, but why did Uplift decide to bring this legal challenge in the first place?
So the UK government, the former Conservative government, approved the Rosebank oil field in 2023. And as I said, we just don't think there's any public policy or public interest argument in favour of it. And we were, I think, strengthened in our confidence in bringing the legal challenge by the Supreme Court's decision in the Finch case. And I know that you've had Sarah Finch on as a guest, but obviously, and this is a point that has been made for years, which Sarah's case was a real breakthrough in relation to, but the fact that an environmental impact assessment for Rosebank didn't take into account the emissions from burning its reserves, in our view, was unlawful, and Sarah's vindicated that. And so we felt like we had pretty strong grounds to legally challenge that development permit. And as it happened, there was a change of government in the meantime, and this government agreed with us in light of the Supreme Court's decision, actually, that the decision had been made unlawfully. So we were hopeful that the Scottish Court of Session would basically quash the consent, and that the developers, Equinor and Ithaca Energy, would need to then reapply. Again, this time fully accounting for the climate harm that project would create.
And just in terms of then your grounds of challenge, so I understand you had one based on the environmental impact assessment. Were there any other arguments that you ran as part of that case?
Yes, we also made an argument that the oil and gas regulator, the North Sea Transition Authority, should have provided more detail about its reasons for approving the development. So the way that oil and gas project consenting works in the UK is that the Secretary of State has to kind of sign off on the environmental assessment, but the oil and gas regulator also has to come to a view that this project should go ahead, but the NSTA, the regulator, doesn't provide its reasons, and we thought that that was unlawful. Unfortunately, that wasn't a ground that we were successful on, but ultimately the Scope 3 emissions ground, the post-Finch ground, was enough to see the challenge through.
So when Sarah Finch came onto the podcast, she mentioned a particular part of Lord Leggett's judgment that I think she will consider particularly powerful, which is you can only care about what you know about. Are there any particular parts of Lord Eric's judgment that you will hold on to and use going forward?
Yeah, definitely. So Lord Eric actually made the point explicitly. I wish I had the quote in front of me, but it was to the effect that the interest of the public in climate change basically outweighs the private interest of the developers. And that, I think, is a really beautiful way of summarising what we are fighting for versus what the oil and gas industry represents, and I think is a really important principle for the work that we do and for the litigation in general.
It's also a powerful point in the context of the NSTA's principal objective, which we'll come back to shortly. But before we do that, has there been any indication that developers will reapply for permission?
Yes, they have said from the beginning that they would, and they've just been invited by the Secretary of State to resubmit their environmental statement, which is the starting gun, in effect, for their applications. So we are expecting that the Secretary of State will need to make a fresh decision on that application by the end of the year. So we've got a fight on our hands.
Yes, yeah. I assume then they will have prepared their EIAs in light of the new guidance, which was published on the 19th of June, because that guidance addresses how developers might assess the Scope 3 emissions in light of the Finch judgment. And I understand you were very heavily involved at Uplift in kind of responding to the consultation on that guidance. And if you kind of summarise your position and what you think of the new guidance.
Yeah, so in short, we think that the new guidance is robust and it takes a position on how you assess the significance of the emissions from one oil and gas field, I think in a way that is quite credible and aligned with how climate science would approach the problem. And to that end, it sort of preempts some of the, I would say, less good faith arguments that the industry likes to make. So the developers both have to account for, in their environmental statement, the starting point is that all of the fuel will be burned. So we're looking at the full effect of combusting the oil and gas in a particular field. The guidance is very clear that in assessing the significance of that, it's not good enough to just say, well, global emissions are 100 gigatons or whatever of CO2, and this would produce 200 megatons, so it's nothing. In fact, what's actually in the guidance is that the assessment should be based on the pathways that are required to meet climate targets and where that project sits against those emissions reduction pathways. And as I said, if you look at those pathways, it's clear that there isn't room for new oil and gas fields. So it kind of gets rid of that drop in the ocean argument that developers like to make. It also puts the onus on developers to prove, again, a favoured argument of the industry, that if, for example, Rosebank wasn't developed in the UK, that a similarly sized oil field would be opened up elsewhere. That means that there's no point in not developing the field here. So it's what's known as the market substitution argument, which doesn't make sense in terms of basic economics. That's not how markets work. But also there is scholarship, academic work that has shown that the effect of keeping a barrel of oil in the ground is that global emissions do reduce. It does have a material effect. So we think that's really strong as well. So, I've got to say that as much as we've been talking about oil and gas extraction from the North Sea, I think this government has done the right thing, both in taking a position that it won't approve new licensing rounds, it won't approve new exploration licensing in the UK, and also it's now produced this quite robust guidance on how to take into account Scope 3 emissions for fields that are waiting for development permits for areas that have already been licensed. So there's definitely stuff to celebrate, I would say.
Interesting as well then that they kind of brought up the point made by Mr. Holgate in the Whitehaven coal mine case regarding the substitution point that you just raised, which is a kind of really important argument. So Tessa, you've obviously been involved in a number of different judicial review cases apart from the Rosebank and Jackdaw one. Are there any other cases that you're particularly proud of or you think it's worth bearing in mind sort of going forward?
Yeah, so in the UK, very early on in Uplift's existence, we supported a case that was actually, the claimants in the case were 3 individuals, but essentially it was focused on the fact that the oil and gas regulator has a statutory mandate. Basically, its principal objective is to maximise economic recovery of offshore oil and gas, which is to say that if it's profitable to any degree, it should come out of the ground. That's the kind of North Star for the regulator. And what this legal challenge was about, which came to be known as the paid to pollute case, it challenged the notion that currently a field is considered profitable even if that's on the basis that it gets massive tax breaks. And the tax regime up until the windfall tax was introduced in 2022 in the UK has been among the most generous in the world for oil and gas companies, to the point that the UK, again, despite being a mature basin, it's very difficult to now get what's left in the North Sea out of the ground. It was the most profitable offshore sector in the world, and that is because of the tax breaks and the way that that has really incentivized production. So the case was ultimately unsuccessful in the High Court, but what it did do was bring to light, and I think this is so important to bear in mind when we're thinking about the cases that we bring, and also more broadly how we communicate about them. It did bring to light, in a lot of the media coverage of the case, these huge tax breaks, which are related to the decommissioning costs that companies can claim from the UK public, as well as investment allowances that they benefit from upfront. But in light of all of those incredibly generous tax policies coming to light, the UK government subsequently introduced a windfall tax. It also has now, under this government, committed to revisiting the entire tax framework once the windfall tax expires in a few years' time, as part of a much broader discussion about the oil and gas industry's profits after gas prices increased and lots of people found it very difficult to pay their energy bills, but we were seeing these literally historic profits on the part of the oil and gas industry. But, I think it's testament to why we often end up winning not in court, but ultimately achieving broader, very useful ends for the claimants. And they were ultimately interested in making sure that the industry paid its part, given its profits, and that's the outcome that's ultimately been secured.
Yes, and certainly the ITJ had some interesting things to say about subsidies, part of fossil fuel industry and that sort of thing. We'll come back to that. Just then to pick up on the NSTA point. So there's a recent consultation in relation to its principal objective, which you mentioned before. What's Uplift's position in relation to what that principal objective should be?
So, as I said, luckily we now have a government in the UK that has revisited its stance in relation to exploration licensing. It is very committed to making the UK a clean energy superpower, as it's described it, and building a huge amount of renewable capacity, particularly in the North Sea. And so we just think it's completely anachronistic for the North Sea Transition Authority's principal objective to be maximising economic recovery of offshore oil and gas. And so we think that the mandate of that regulator should be totally aligned instead with the broader energy and public policy goals that the UK government has. And that includes supporting a transition for the workforce, supporting supply chains to pivot away from oil and gas to renewables and so on. But that is an objective that belongs to decades ago, in short, and a very different economic and industrial focus for the UK.
One of the points that you've spoken about in the past, which I think is really interesting and often neglected, is actually how they go about the upstream production methods in the North Sea. I mean, first of all, what's your concern there?
Well, you'll often hear the oil and gas industry say that for as long as we accept that we're going to reduce our use of oil and gas, that the Climate Change Committee says that we've got to get to 1.5 degrees, and in the transition, there will still be some oil and gas used. And if we're going to use some, we might as well produce it here because it's cleaner than what you would import otherwise. I think aside from the fact that, as I said, just because we produce it here doesn't mean we then own it and can use it, we also think it's pretty insincere for them to claim that UK production is cleaner than the alternative for a couple of reasons. First of all, we get most of our gas imported from Norway, which actually is much cleaner in its production methods than the UK. We are, of course, talking just about methods for extracting the oil or gas. So it doesn't even account for the main source of emissions from oil and gas, which is what happens when you burn them. But even if we just limit ourselves to those production methods, Norway, for example, has banned flaring decades ago, which isn't the case in the UK. Also, according to the North Sea Transition Authority, the UK's oil production methods, because our rigs are getting old, because the basin is declining, all of that has meant that our oil production methods aren't in even the top 50% cleanest production in the world. So that's just not true. And the industry will like to point to the dirtiest possible source of imports, which are LNG imports from Qatar, and use that as the basis for the comparison. But, that is a tiny fraction of our overall import of oil and gas.
I mean, do you think regulation could address this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that there have been multiple studies that show that we're a long way from even accurately estimating methane leakage from oil and gas rigs. There is so much more that the UK government could do to make sure that for as long as we've got these rigs that are operating in the North Sea, that they operate in a way that is much cleaner and much more heavily regulated.
Thanks, Tessa. So, right, I think we need to deal with the elephant in the room, the ICJ's advisory opinion. To remind the listener, this is the opinion in relation to the various obligations on states under international law to ensure the protection of the climate system and parts of the environment from the anthropogenic emissions, as well as the legal consequences of those obligations where significant harm has been caused. There's already been a lot of online commentary about this opinion, rightly so. But let's think about what it says about the fossil fuel industry, Tessa. What strikes you as particularly important?
Well, there are specific statements by the court about the fact that in light of that temperature target of 1.5 degrees, which it validates as being the overall objective that governments have agreed to, that the continued licensing and production of fossil fuels could constitute an internationally wrongful act. Those are the words of the court. And that, I think, is a pretty clear notice to governments who are overwhelmingly responsible for licensing decisions, that in addition to, as I said, the very clear evidence that new oil and gas production isn't compatible with our climate limits, that there's real legal risk in them continuing to do so.
I think what's also interesting in the judgment is it does set out in some detail the significant contribution of the fossil fuel industry to climate change. I mean, it's an obvious point to make, but I still think it's helpful having it in there in kind of black and white. On the issue of attribution, court kind of picks up on this point about fossil fuel production and consumption. I don't know if you kind of summarise what they say on the point of attribution and what your views are on it.
Well, they're quite clear that if you can attribute a particular event to climate change, it is then for courts to then look at individual cases of whether it's a country or arguably a fossil fuel company and its contribution to the overall concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and to then be able to draw the causal link to the harm that has ultimately caused. And that's an argument that we're already seeing invoked in cases in domestic jurisdictions, like the RWE case in Germany, in which a Peruvian farmer made the argument that Germany's biggest energy company, RWE, should be held responsible for the fact that his village in the Peruvian Andes was likely to be flooded as a result of melting glaciers, and RWE has contributed X percentage to global greenhouse gas emissions. And that sort of chain was also recognised by the court as being valid in Germany. And I think having this in the advisory opinion as well strengthens those causation-related arguments.
Yes, and it's interesting, isn't it? In particular, as you say, thinking about the role of private actors and states' obligations in relation to private actors, the most obvious ones being those in the fossil fuel industry. There's also an interesting point, isn't there, where they talk about granting of fossil fuel exploration licenses, which they identify as possibly an internationally wrongful act, which is the point that you picked up on earlier, and goes so far as to say that the provision of fossil fuel subsidies may also constitute such an internationally wrongful act. So, I mean, where does this take us all? I mean, are you optimistic about it? I mean, ties back to the point you made at the very start. There is potentially this gap between these very lovely international legal opinions and what happens on the ground. How do you think it could be best deployed going forward?
Well, I think as I said, it really puts governments on notice about how these legal obligations should be interpreted and might be interpreted by national courts. So I think that's powerful. You know, we know that when governments are developing policies that they take advice from counsel and think about the legal implications. Hopefully this will all shape the way that those conversations unfold. I think it definitely opens up space for people to use what the ICJ has said in domestic policy conversations and to just point to the fact that, the world's highest court has recognised the incompatibility potentially of what governments are continuing to do at pace with what their legal obligations are as defined by international law. So I think basically the onus is now on us, and by us I mean lawyers and campaigners and advocates more broadly, to find ways of embedding in a nationally relevant way what the ICJ has said, whether that's via litigation or via opinions that really look specifically at the interaction of what the AO, the advisory opinion, lays out with national legal frameworks. I think the job is to socialise that to the maximum extent possible.
Finally, Tessa, the question I ask all my guests, what do you see as the greatest barrier or development, that's legal barrier or development, in addressing climate change?
Well, you won't be surprised to know that I think it's the fossil fuel industry. I really think it's the incumbents. This system works for the industries that are the incumbent industries, and they have a lot to lose from the transition, which is why we know that the oil and gas industry and organisations like Influence Map have documented this, but they've spent billions of dollars lobbying against climate change policy, including after the Paris Agreement was concluded, despite their rhetoric about the industry being committed to transitioning to, some of that has fallen away in the last year. They're not even pretending to be interested in pivoting to renewable energy. Companies like Shell and BP have dropped effectively their renewable energy targets. And so they are basically just trying to, for as long as possible, make as much profit as possible and to block the policies that are going to be the ones that ensure that that transition happens. So I think that's a reason in and of itself for trying to address the role that they play within the UK in our economy and in our politics. But I think it's definitely possible. I think, it can sound really David and Goliath, but I think the windfall tax being introduced in 2022, that was because of public anger about fossil fuel industry profits and a sense that they're really not looking out for our collective interests. And it led to a historic change for an industry that's very used to getting its own way in the UK. The fact that we now have a government that's committed to ending exploration licensing is also a massive development. Finch decision, the new EIA guidance, I think it's world-leading guidance. So I don't think they are in any way immune from ultimately being shifted out of the picture. But I do think that we have to be very clear that that is something that we need to address.
Tessa, thank you so much for your time. It's been an amazing conversation.
Thank you so much, Steph. I've really enjoyed it.